When I began my research, I was interested in this question about how contested illnesses become legitimate. How do they emerge from illness status into be considered real diseases? And this quote by Brown et al. Suggests that the emergence of a disease or a new illness is an epidemiological process. It's a process of figuring out the cause and the treatment of that illness, but it's also a social process. There are actors, there are stakeholders, there are agencies, there are sufferers, there are real people involved in this process that take an illness into its status as a disease. The outline here that I want to follow today is to talk about 3 questions. How do some contested illnesses become legitimate diseases and others not? How do people know when they have a contested illness? And how do doctors actually diagnose these illnesses that some would even argue don't exist or are unclear? These are the questions that sort of framed my research. I'm going to talk about 3 different contested illnesses to help us think today about how illnesses emerge as both a social and an epidemiological process. First of all, I want to talk about chronic fatigue syndrome. How many of you have heard of the term before, chronic fatigue syndrome? Okay. Some characteristics of chronic fatigue is that people estimate that it affects about 17 million people worldwide, including about 1 million Americans. Common statistics. It's got an interesting history to it. It emerged as an illness in the United States in the 1980s. Groups of sufferers got together in the 1980s and developed and joined a group called CFIS, Chronic Fatigue Immune Dysfunction Syndrome. And they began to share their information and their ideas about the disease and put pressure on and lobby physician groups, government agencies to get the disease recognized. In 1988, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, published a case definition. In other words, a standard definition of the diagnostic criteria for CFS. It's called the Holmes criteria. Public support for CFS continued. I don't know, some of you actually maybe not have been alive in 1990, that's possible. Newsweek published a cover story about CFS, blaming the yuppie flu. And in 1995, Congress held briefings, and the Department of Health and Human Services put actual sufferers with CFS on some of their committees to advocate for recognition and services, patient advocates. And then most recently in 2000, the CDC convened a case definition workshop to further specification of what CFS is. And the CDC uses now this definition. This is the case definition of chronic fatigue syndrome. Typo in it, and results twice here. It's got a definition about that involves fatigue, and you have to have 4 or more of the following symptoms. I put up the case definition here to illustrate that one thing that helps move a contested illness from its contested or ambiguous or controversial status into disease status is a case definition. A case definition helps sufferers be able to self-diagnose and identify when they might have an illness or not. It helps physicians diagnose that. If you get diagnosis happening, then you can then begin to lobby and advocate for all sorts of assistance and protections. The case definition is key. And in chronic fatigue, the case definition has been around for about 9 years. The CDC website even has a little set of graphics about the process one should use to seek and obtain diagnosis if you think you have one. I thought this was sort of interesting that CDC has this pictorial representation of the steps you need to take. I know it's hard to read here, but you can sort of see that you interact with physicians and you have to be tested, right? Get the results. You have to follow certain criteria to see if there are treatments and results that would help you. That's the process the CDC has set out for this. So it's a pretty well-defined process. The symptoms of chronic fatigue include fatigue, cognitive problems, muscle pain, poor sleep, sore throat. There's some representations of chronic fatigue that are out there. CFS also is recognized as a qualifying disability by a number of government agencies, which allow individuals that are diagnosed with CFS to get assistance. The Social Security Administration considers it worthy of being able to obtain resources. The Americans with Disabilities Act protects people with CFS. And the Department of Veterans Affairs actually diagnoses vets sometimes with CFS. Even though CFS is emerging as a legitimate disease, there's still dispute over the name for the condition. It's often called, CFS is called the illness of 1,000 names. I think there's 1,000 here, but there are a lot. And people still dispute what term or what name we should apply to chronic fatigue syndrome worldwide. What you should recognize by just looking at some of these definitions, some of these names, is that the names reflect probably a set of assumptions about what causes CFS. Is it an immune system problem? Is it a virus? Is it a problem of having cell abnormalities? Reflected in these different names that people advocate for are assumptions about its causation. And there are lots of different causes that people propose for CFS, meaning that it's still somewhat contested. Some people argue that it's basically a viral disease. Other people argue that it's an immune system problem. Some people argue that it affects hormonal levels based on physical or emotional stress. Some people argue and find in research that's related to low blood pressure. Some argue that it's linked to nutritional deficiencies. And then, of course, others argue that it's a brain abnormality problem. So there are a range of supposed causation for CFS. The research continues, and this is important in moving a contested illness along. This is a reflection of the first page and some pages from a recent Science article that came out. The journal Science is a preeminent journal that has published, I think it was only a couple weeks ago, the reports of a group of researchers finding or arguing that CFS is primarily caused by a virus. And although it's hard to see here, this particular table represents this idea that if indeed CFS is a viral illness, it's a retrovirus. It will be the first retrovirus discovered since HIV. So some people argue that CFS might actually have links down the chain to other retroviruses. Important piece of research. The media has also picked up this piece of research and this controversy. This is from the New York Times about a week and a half ago. And so the idea here too is that public perception of illness is sometimes shaped by media reports and research reports that make it in. There's lots of literature out there, medical, popular versions of how to treat and understand CFS, representation of some common books. Public acceptance of CFS continues to be a battleground, which I'm sure nicely represents the attitudes and beliefs of many folks that have had CFS, that they experience. I would argue that all of these pieces of information suggest that one reason CFS has emerged as a new disease is because sufferers themselves have mobilized enough to advocate for resources to go towards research, for doctors to develop case definitions. In fact, the case definition itself, there's wide consensus that this case definition represents an accurate depiction of what the symptoms are of CFS, and so this leads to physician diagnosis. It's also a less contested disease because more and more of the research points to that there is a biomedical explanation. It's not psychosomatic, it's not psychological as an explanation of the disease. And there's increasing institutional acceptance and portrayal of CFS as a legitimate disease. So CFS represents a good example of a contested illness that's become more of a legitimate disease and sort of shows us as a case study the roadmap that illnesses take to become considered more legitimate. It's a little different with the case of multiple chemical sensitivity. How many of you heard that before, that term? MCS. Goes by many different names too. It's got a little different history, but it's commonly defined in the following way. It's an illness of multi-system symptoms that result from chemical exposure at doses below the thresholds causing effects in the general population. It's an illness in which many of your organs and systems are affected as a result of being exposed to certain chemicals or toxins and continuing reactions to that exposure at a level that are below the doses for the general population. There is no estimates of the number of people with MCS, but the National Academy of Sciences estimates that about 15 to 20% of the American population has sensitivities to common chemicals. Is that true of anybody here in the audience, that you react perhaps to certain smells like diesel smells or perfumes or anything like that? That's what we're talking about here. Here's some common symptoms of MCS. Fatigue, headaches, rashes. I like the picture of the woman. Toxic chemicals. And the little table over here represents some of the different names that MCS goes by among sufferers and those that are out there. The history of the development of the illness of MCS goes back to the 1950s and probably originates with the work of Dr. Randolph, who basically wrote this medical paper where he described what he called chemical sensitivity, CS, and argued that he was seeing individuals with CS as a result of their exposure to both indoor and outdoor chemicals in the environments. In 1989, several years later, the American College of Physicians published a very extensive report on CS and concluded that there really wasn't a lot of research and evidence supporting this illness of CS, nor was there evidence supporting what they called clinical ecology. Clinical ecology is a new emerging specialization within the medical establishment where people look at exposures to chemicals as resulting in disease. In the 1980s, a number of preeminent medical institutions rejected MCS as a disorder whatsoever, and basically said to physicians, if someone comes in your office claiming to or asking to be diagnosed with MCS, don't treat them as if they have a disease. So you're seeing here this controversy within the medical establishment itself, people arguing for and against, and an evolving story. However, in 1991, the National Institute of Environmental Sciences, part of the NIH, found that MCS was a chronic recurring disease caused by a person's inability to tolerate environmental chemicals or any foreign chemicals. So you have different definitions, different perspectives on whether this is real or not. In the 1990s, as a result of these contradictions and disagreements, a number of agencies provided research support, monies, funding to researchers and individuals to study MCS further. And then in 1996, the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the SSA both began recognizing MCS as a qualifying disabling condition, and individuals began winning cases involving workmen's compensation that claimed they had MCS. So it's a mixed picture here, right? You see people basically claiming that it doesn't exist as a disorder, institutions getting behind that, and other individuals winning resources and access based on the diagnosis. There is no clear consensus about a case definition in MCS like there is in chronic fatigue syndrome. Most people refer back to Cullen's 1987 definition of MCS, which lays out 4 criteria. The first criteria being a reflection of earlier work. The second criteria, an interesting one here, pointing out that one would qualify as having MCS even if no evidence existed of current organ damage. Although one would, in number 3, have to point out when they think they were exposed to a toxin or a chemical that caused their problems. And finally, that 4, MCS is assumed to affect multiple organ systems that are in response to toxins and chemicals in the environment. Subsequent attempts here to develop a new case definition or to get some consensus among the medical establishment about CFS have failed, the most recent being by the Chemical Injury Information Network, which is a very large group supported by thousands of sufferers. They put together a working group in 2006 to try and define, give a case definition to MCS, and were unable to do so. And individuals that have a stake in understanding MCS disagree over the name for the disorder, much like in CFS. Again, that's a typical characteristic of a contested illness. You can see here there's lots of different definitions, and once again they probably reflect assumptions about the causation of these illnesses. Some people would argue in the first 3 that what MCS is an illness in response to some extreme toxin or poison or environmental chemical that made one deathly ill, usually one event, that one sees then further symptoms. Others would argue that maybe it occurred in the workplace through low-dose exposure over time, sick building syndrome. Others argue that it's really a phenomenon that affects many of us as an environmental illness or a 20th century syndrome, and that we're all exposed to chemicals and toxins in our everyday lives, and some have some low level of MCS. So there are different definitions and different etiologies. People that claim they have MCS assume that their reactions are triggered by a number of different things. Most commonly, this could be different types of pesticides, organophosphates. It could be different volatile chemicals, such as perfume or diesel exhaust. It might be exposure to household chemicals, including aerosol sprays. It might be personal care products, like your perfume, shampoo. It might be things in your home, like carpeting or particle board. It might be the food that you eat, the additives, preservatives in those foods. Or it could be caused by toxic mold. In other words, all the constituencies that argue that they have chronic reactions to this list of chemicals might come under this umbrella term of MCS. It's interesting when you look at individuals with MCS how they understand and figure out they have MCS. In the communities, they talk about unmasking their symptoms. One of the standards that doctors use to try and figure out if someone actually qualifies as having MCS is to use what they call challenge testing, which is to put the person in a room and expose them to a lot of different chemicals on a random basis and see how they react. Another way of doing this is through typical blood and skin prick tests that allergists might use. And then some physicians also use surveys, the QC, which is a self-screening test. So there are diagnostic tools out there, they're quite varied, that are used to figure out if one has MCS. Some of the possible causes of MCS, there are many. Some people argue it's an immune system dysfunction. Others argue it's on the basis of behavioral conditioning, that one develops an aversion to chemicals. Some argue that it's tied to the nervous system or enzyme depletion. Others argue, and there's a growing movement, that MCS actually is what we call an environmental illness, an EI, which Dr. Hoger talked about. The American Academy of Environmental Medicine actually defines MCS or EI as the following. Take a look at this. Again, it's exposure to some discernible, some level of chemical or toxic exposure that would affect your body, either a single system or multiple systems. your symptoms might be wide and varied, and they might even vary among individuals who got exposed to the same toxin, to the same poison, in the same place. And basically what happens after initial exposure is that even further exposures of the same chemical or toxin or poison make you react, but perhaps you don't need as much of the presence of that chemical or poison to do so. The media has also picked up this idea that MCS is an environmental illness. And this appeared in the New York Times about 3 weeks ago. And the idea here that our homes are very dangerous places full of toxins and chemicals that affect us. That's sort of the idea here of the environmental movement, talking about MCS as a harbinger. People with MCS use an array of different treatments. Probably the most common one, since the etiology is unclear, is basically to avoid anything that would trigger a reaction. So if you see someone wearing a mask, that may be because they don't wish to smell the diesel or intake the perfume, along those lines. Other common treatments are to be treated for allergies or to be evaluated if you've got toxic poisoning. Some physicians prescribe medications. Some physicians would work with you for antifungal therapy if you think it's a mold allergy. Some people argue that it's a hormone or a thyroid imbalance that needs chemical treatment. And others argue that basically you should take diagnostic steps to rule out other illnesses. So there's a number of different treatments. What's also true in the MCS community is that many people look to alternative treatments, CAM therapies, contemporary alternative medicine. Of websites and listservs and support groups that sufferers participate in to try and identify various therapies, different types of diets, getting doses of oxygen through oxygen masks on a regular basis, injections of vitamins, all sorts of different things. MCS remains a more contested illness for these reasons than CFS. Primarily because its sufferers have been less successful in advocating for resources from the medical establishment and from different government agencies. They haven't gotten together and mobilized as well. It's a larger group and a more diverse group. They also lack a clear case definition. So one thing that's clear here is that moving an illness from an emergent status into disease status is that you need a clear case definition. And the problem here with MCS is that it still lacks that. And there's a lot of public sentiment out there, I think it would be fair to say, that thinks that MCS is not a true disease and that it lacks real clear evidence of causation. Third illness I'm going to talk about here is Gulf War syndrome. How many of you have heard of that before? Gulf War illness, Gulf War syndrome. People began talking about Gulf War syndrome. It was primarily the veterans that returned from the Persian Gulf War that were experiencing higher rates of problems that they felt were not being treated and not being understood. And they began to advocate as they talked to one another in various groups and organizations for vets returning from the war that perhaps they had an illness in common. They started using the term Gulf War syndrome. About 20,000 veterans have registered with the Persian Gulf War database, and about a third of them report that they have some form of chronic multi-system illness, oftentimes used as evidence of Gulf War syndrome. In 1991, there was a study of a large group of veterans by the Department of Defense that basically found that even though veterans were reporting severe symptoms as a basis of their Gulf service, that there was no clinical evidence for the syndrome per se. And instead, these study researchers concluded that if veterans were complaining of these symptoms, then what we were seeing primarily was a psychological illness as a result of service. In 1997, a researcher by the name of Haley and his colleagues conducted a study of 240 veterans, and Haley and his colleagues reported that they found a relationship between exposures to various chemical nerve agents, like sarin, and neurological and behavioral risk factors in vets. Haley, to some extent, became the individual researcher that was seen by many Gulf War veterans as bringing the truth to this issue. Studies in the 1990s looked at and compared vets that were deployed in the Gulf War and compared them to vets who were not deployed in the Gulf War in terms of multi-system illnesses. And they looked at vets from not just the United States, but from the UK. In particular, folks across these different groups. And what you see here in this table, or should see, is that the number of illnesses being reported were higher among Gulf War vets. Yet the findings were somewhat contradictory. Some studies found an association between exposure to neurochemicals during the Gulf War and veterans' illness problems. Other studies did not. Some studies reported these as psychological problems. And then in 2008, Congress put together a committee that looked at the 100 key studies analyzing Gulf War syndrome. And Congress concluded there was a clear link between exposures to specific chemicals, including pesticides, anti-nerve gas, and nerve gas sarin. Most recently, however, the Veterans Affairs just pulled the plug on Haley's research. And a number of people are happy about this within the VA and within the medical community, and other people argue that more research needs to be done. But Gulf War syndrome is at a place where most of the money for its research has somewhat been halted. Researchers nonetheless continue to investigate different causes of Gulf War syndrome. Some argue that it's because of the dust that originates from depleted uranium. Others argue that it's caused by the vaccines that vets took to limit anthrax. There's actually never been any studies, clinical studies looking at the effects of anthrax. Some argue that it was because of chemical weapons, reaction to those. Some argue that it's because of nerve gas and insect repellents that vets were exposed to. And others argue that it might be tied to parasites or oil, fire, smoke inhalation. What you should be seeing here is that Gulf War syndrome is a contested illness to some extent because there's lots of different explanations about its possible causation. And there's research that both supports and does not support evidence of biological factors causing symptoms. So there's no case definition as well for Gulf War syndrome. And what has happened as a result here the last few years is that the Department of Veterans Affairs, while it cannot give a diagnosis of Gulf War syndrome to a vet to get resources or assistance, the VA has decided to apply a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. In the veterans communities, many people argue that they're getting the wrong diagnosis, but at least they're getting a diagnosis, basically, that allows them to get services and resources. So by looking at these different contested illnesses, we can see some of the important processes that move an illness into a disease. We can see how individuals with different medically unexplained symptoms come to see themselves as having organic causes. We could look at how medical practitioners actually diagnose some of these illnesses that people consider controversial, and we could look at various stakeholders, what they have to say about this. My own research has looked at how individuals come to believe they have a contested illness. If people disagree about the nature and definition and causation and treatment of an illness, how do you know you have it when you have it? What I've discovered in interviewing individuals with these different illnesses is that they develop what we would call layperson expertise. they often go down the road where they research and find out as much as, if not more than, the physicians and experts around them. They become lay experts. One of the first things that happens to many people when they seek treatment or assistance or diagnosis from a physician is that they are told by the physician that their illness is psychological. And here's a quote from an individual that I interviewed that sort of illustrates this common process of being labeled as having a psychological disorder when they, in fact, they thought they had something different. The quote suggests that what the doctor was doing is reversing, right, the direction of the problem here. The individual saying, if I had anxiety, if I had these psychological problems, because I have a real illness. The second quote also illustrates this idea that being labeled with a psychological illness is something one has to sort of make sense of and reject. It's the perspective of the individual seeing a physician. So one thing that's very common to all individuals when they seek assistance for a contested illness is that they often get labeled as having a psychological illness, a psychological problem. And for them to continue down the road, they have to reject that perspective. What's also common among individuals seeking diagnosis for contested illnesses is that they have to negotiate. They have to fight with and negotiate with their physicians about that. And this quote illustrates the idea here that for many individuals what they do is they go seeking to find a doctor who will tell them that they have the particular illness that they believe they have, or a doctor who will give them answers. Some people have been critical of this, arguing that many people doctor shop until they find the diagnosis they want, right? From the perspective of the ill individual, they're basically running up against a certain perspective and having to negotiate that. This other quote also illustrates this. Quote illustrates that oftentimes individuals, it's common in these illnesses to bring some of the research they've found and present it to a doctor who may not be aware of that research of that illness. So they become a lay expert. They become, in their eyes, as much as, if not more so, an expert than their own physician. Another resource is that they participate in what is called intentional communities. They get involved in various support groups or online discussion groups of other sufferers, other people also seeking answers or assuming they have these illnesses. And this quote suggests that one of the, from a participant in one of the studies I conducted, suggests that there's a lot of benefit to participating in these groups. They get some confirmation that what they have is real. And also they get access to resources. Second quote also illustrates this, that participating in these online groups, which there are many, helps them figure out exactly what their illness is. Some examples of some of these virtual communities. A big group is called Sick Buildings. It's been around for about 10 years, has over 2,300 members. There are something like 175, 200 postings a day where people are sharing their information about treatments, sharing their perspective about illness, sharing information about resources with other individuals. The description here of the group describes that it's built for people basically that believe they have either mold-induced or health problems associated with working in a sick building. Another group, not as big as Green Canary, it's been around about 9 years, about 600 folks. This group is an online discussion group devoted to people that basically, whether they define themselves as having MCS or environmental illness, want to live a life that's free of toxic chemicals. So they're devoted to talking about various treatments and sharing those treatments. The other thing that's interesting in these if you look at sufferers of contested illnesses, they often develop their own theories about what causes their illness. Based on the research, based on their discussions with other sufferers, they develop what we call their own vernacular health theories. They become not only experts in how to diagnose and understand and how to treat their illness, but actually propose theories of what their illness is caused by. This quote sort of illustrates that, a quote from an individual describing this. It's common among individuals to experiment on their own body, to experiment with lots of different treatments to figure out what works and what doesn't, because there are no known treatments. Second quotation conveys that this individual believes that their illness is shared by many people out there that perhaps don't understand that they have this illness, and that they see, in this case, MCS. They see their experience of having this illness as sort of a sign, a harbinger of sort of what a lot of us have to look forward to down the road, given the amount of chemicals and toxins in our environments. They have this theory that their illness represents that for larger society. All of these experiences suggest that as individuals share their illness experience, the illness itself becomes a collective phenomenon, a collective illness experience, a type of health social movement. And so I'd like to suggest to you that basically we're not talking about hundreds or thousands of people, but we're talking about thousands and thousands of people who define themselves and see themselves as having these illnesses, and to some extent they're untapped social movements about healthcare reform, healthcare issues in our culture. My research also looks at how medical practitioners diagnose contested illnesses, which was the question I began with in my work in disability services. I wanted to figure out how doctors could diagnose an illness when there was no clear case definition, and how they could attribute that. So I did conduct a survey, a national survey of physicians, to figure out how they did so. It's important to understand sort of the standard diagnostic process that physicians use for diagnosing an illness. I don't know if you thought about that when you're in the doctor's office, but Groupman suggests that there are three things that happen when doctors diagnose an illness. They basically use what we call pattern recognition. They take your history, they examine you, they do tests, and they're looking for patterns. They're looking how things fit together, how they fit a pattern, how they can organize the disease into a pattern. They also tend to use evaluation tools to increase their certainty that you have what they think you have, and to become more familiar with the problem. And typically, Groupman argues that then what physicians do is that they'll propose a hypothesis to explain the illness they think you have. When I looked at physicians, I found that we're diagnosing chronic fatigue syndrome, that we're diagnosing multiple chemical sensitivity, that we're diagnosing Goforth syndrome. I found that they did indeed utilize their knowledge to increase their pattern recognition. This is a very detailed table that looks at physicians who diagnose CFS, MCS, and Goforth syndrome, and what sort of information and expertise they use to diagnose these illnesses. It compares individuals who have diagnosed less than one, none, and physicians who have diagnosed more than one in each of these illnesses. It's a complicated table, but what it suggests is that what physicians who diagnose these illnesses do is that they go out and get more information to make sure that they're certain that what they're doing is correct. They look at the protocols. They look at the case definitions. If they didn't know that they existed, they go out and find them. They use different information sources. They read the latest current research in the medical journals. They read the conference proceedings. They read the media reports. They go to the internet and they search for information that's on the internet. They ask other physicians. One of the things that oftentimes is argued in the medical community is that the physicians that are diagnosing these contested illnesses are basically people that don't have to be convinced themselves. They already believe in them. They're not really doing a good job as physicians to question the validity of these illnesses. And what I found instead was that whether they're experts or not, whether they've been diagnosing a lot of people or not, what distinguishes their diagnostic process is that when they don't know, they go out and they get more information. And they get it from some very legitimate sources. These physicians that are diagnosing these contested illnesses also use a lot of different evaluation tools, which is good and bad depending on how you see their sort of use of healthcare resources. But basically when someone walks in their office to be diagnosed, what they tend to do is use a lot of different evaluation tools to figure it out. They might look at how well they, what their experiences and reactions are to certain treatments. They might give them a psychological evaluation. They might look at other types of illnesses that they have or give them empirical tests. They would use their medical history. They would take all of these forms of information and tools to increase their certainty. And they would also, like typical doctors do, develop what we call provisional hypotheses. They would either assume that they knew what the causation was of these illnesses, or they decide to sort of live with the uncertainty and nonetheless diagnose them. The information here suggests that contested illnesses become public health concerns in 4 ways. One of the things that's key for an illness to become a disease is that sufferers who are denied health care have to collectively get together to develop alternative explanations and advocate for the legitimacy of their disease. That's happening far more in something like chronic fatigue syndrome than it is in multiple chemical sensitivity, but there you see some differences. For a disease to become legitimate, researchers have to investigate that illness. There has to be resources and funding to do so, and they have to move towards a biomedical model. Practitioners, physicians themselves have developed practices to overcome their uncertainty. And the media also has to come to some conclusions about whether or not they think these illnesses are legitimate. I'd like to close here to some extent with this quotation by Goldsmith and Ladd that suggests a window on how to look at contested illnesses. The bodies of those with contested illnesses are both anomalies and exemplars, provoking a crisis in one paradigm while serving as an objective embodiment of another. For biomedicine, the body of the individual with a contested illness presents an array of unclassifiable signs and symptoms augmented by the patient's lay theory of etiology. These individuals also violate the social definition of sickness. Encoded in their bodies and the stories they tell about them is the need to invert the logic of the sick role, deflecting attention from a clinical appraisal of the physical body to a critical appraisal of the social body. The very nature of these contested illnesses suggests that the medical paradigm is going to be insufficient for understanding and treating these illnesses. And by nature of asserting that one has a contested illness, you are changing the definition of the sick role. It's not you that is sick, it's the society that's sick and unable to authenticate and legitimate your illness. And regardless of how we think about this, it's important to understand that we're talking about ill people. And this quote by Susan Sontag is what I'll close with, to suggest that while you may think of individuals with contested illnesses as the other, at some point all of us get sick and all of us cross over into the night side of life. Is it okay, Laura, to take a few questions?
Yeah.
Or comments?
Let me ask you a gender question. In some of the history of contested illnesses that become legitimized illnesses, is there a tipping point in your overview that when enough men become sick with it, it becomes legitimized?
It's an interesting perspective. A lot of people argue that these illnesses are primarily female illnesses, that it's primarily women that get these illnesses. One reason I considered studying Gulf War syndrome as being similar to that is I think it sort of undoes that sort of idea that perhaps that's not the case. I see it more as a social and epidemiological process that allows an illness to emerge into a disease, not so much a gender issue. But you still can't escape the fact that primarily women are the ones being diagnosed with CFS and MCS. What do you think?
Well, I put Gulf War syndrome actually in another category because I know what a manipulative, secretive government we have who would not want to pay all those veterans' benefits. So I think that there are other factors at work in Gulf War syndrome. But I mean, it just seems to me that if you look at heart care, for heart illnesses, and you see how men are treated versus women are treated, and there are big differences when women come in with certain symptomologies versus men. I mean, so it seems to me that in these illnesses where it's not so clear, that there would be even bigger differences in how they're treated. You know, so that's, I mean, so just in medical care in general, the treatment of men is different than women.
I guess my perspective here is that all contested illnesses, all diseases start out to some extent as contested illnesses. They all emerge and basically eventually become organic illnesses. So you're right, there may be some tipping point that also includes gender there. Charlie?
Just to piggyback on what Donna said, looking at gender, I'm also thinking of age coming from the whole gerontology piece. How, and I don't know if you looked at it, people who are 65 and older, do you think that they have a more difficult time actually presenting their contested illnesses to their physicians because it may be perceived as normal part of aging?
I don't know how to answer that. I don't know the answer to that. I would assume that there's probably going to be some factors related to age that would make it more difficult, but that also would depend on the physician and the nature of the illness. I don't know how to answer that. That's a good question. What do you think?
I'm thinking that it may be a little more difficult for seniors, and especially because of societal constructs as well. You know, well, they're supposed to be like this, especially with the very first one that you talked about, with fatigue syndrome. I think maybe sometimes seniors are overlooked or poo-pooed, and it could be something else.
MCS is such a wide disorder too that there are different cohorts even within that disorder that might be affected. I mean, some folks argue that it's basically a workplace illness, that one picks it up from the workplace, sick building syndrome. Other people would argue that it's primarily acquired through home ownership and the experience of being exposed to toxic mold. So gender and age may have some effect on each of those things.
One of the books we read all the time in policy science, Making an Issue of Child Abuse, looks at this, that when a private issue becomes a public issue and where that point is. And one of the things that Robert Nelson argues in this book is that we medicalize things in order to make them easier because they're just, if we had to deal with the real social issues, it would just be too complicated. And so I find it fascinating that these groups are advocating for their medicalization as opposed to the socialization of the problem.
Absolutely. Within the field of disability studies, we often look at problems of disability or illness as a social phenomenon, not a medical phenomenon. So this has really changed the way I sort of think about even the phenomenon of medicalization. Because here I am studying a group of people, as you said, who want further medicalization because they want the protections and the resources and the label and to be able to inhabit the sick role that otherwise would be denied to them. And that carries certain repercussions in terms of how people then see your illness as something biomedical and therefore don't have to look at the social problems and the real environmental reasons perhaps that your illness is originating in the first place. I find it fascinating too. Bob?
Yeah, it seems like a lot of these diseases may in earlier times been considered hypochondria, and where they were not real, and that people were imagining these diseases. But it's kind of just listening to what you're saying kind of hit home. My father was always said to be a hypochondriac, but then he died at 50 of heart disease, and so apparently undiagnosed. So, but it may have been chronic fatigue syndrome or something else. But so it's, it's interesting to see that, back then they might have, in earlier age they might have had, different diseases like this, but the people refused to diagnose them.
I think that's a really fascinating aspect of this too, in that people argue about whether they're psychosomatic, they're psychological, they're really organic, right? Until there's enough research, you really can't argue that they're organic. But there's an underlying question of a lot of these new illnesses. Are they particular to our time? Are they really 20th century diseases? Or have they been around for a long time under different guises? And there are people that argue both ways. It's a way of, the window here on contested illnesses helps you think about some of those questions and issues that arise about medicalization, whether it's a good or bad thing, about whether illnesses are new and emerge, or they've been around under different definitions before. I find it fascinating too.
Yeah, it seems to me that the force of saying it's just psychological is often equivalent to saying it's your problem. But I had an interruption, so I didn't hear the whole argument. But my sense is that what we're talking about are things that are clearly not just some individual's problems, even though there are many groups that don't necessarily form a clear unity. We're talking about lots of people who are, and when they get together and talk, they recognize that they're sharing symptoms and so on, right? So if that's the case, then the force of the statement, it's just psychological, has no force at all because the psychological is real. And so I think maybe that's what, my point is sort of related to what Robin was saying, even if you can't translate it into something organic and medical, if it is a social phenomenon, it may be related to the workplace, the environment, who knows what, but it's real and needs to be understood and improved.
And to some extent, what the VA did with Gulf War syndrome is said, it seems real. We're not disputing you have symptoms, but we're not going to label Gulf War syndrome. We're going to label it PTSD and give you the same resources. So sort of authenticating that perspective that you're pointing out.
But also seems to me that there's another way that diseases become legitimate in our current world, which is that the drug companies develop something to treat it. And we're seeing this with fibromyalgia. Now that they have a drug, all of a sudden it's a whole different kind of illness. And they're trying to get approval to treat chronic fatigue with some of those same drugs. So that we also have this whole monetary, financial thing that's going on that makes a disease legitimate by developing a treatment. Restless legs is another one. Restless leg syndrome was identified a long time ago, but now it's a big disease that everyone must have because we have a treatment solution for it.
One thing I like to do is pursue that avenue. I didn't talk about it very much here, or not very well, but the media and public conceptions, as well as big pharma sort of represented that, or big science represented that, how they push ideas about what is real and not real in terms of illness by throwing resources and pharmaceutical and drugs behind them to do that. I'd like to take a look at that.